Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Preface. On scientific cognition. Continued. But this abhorrence, in fact, stems from ignorance of the nature of mediation and of absolute cognition itself. For mediation is nothing beyond self-moving self-sameness, or is reflection into self, the moment of the I, which is for itself pure negativity, or when reduced to its pure abstraction, simple becoming. The I, or becoming in general, this mediation, on account of its simple nature, is just immediacy in the process of becoming, and is the immediate itself. Reason is therefore misunderstood when reflection is excluded from the true, and is not grasped as a positive moment of the absolute. It is reflection that makes the true a result, but it is equally reflection that overcomes the antithesis between the process of its becoming and the result. For this becoming is also simple, and therefore not different from the form of the true, which shows itself as simple in its result. The process of becoming is rather just this return into simplicity, though the embryo is indeed in itself and a human being, it is not so for itself. This it only is as cultivated reason, which has made itself into what it is in itself, and that is when it is for the first time is actual. But this result is itself a simple immediacy, for it is self-conscious freedom at peace with itself, which has not set the antithesis on one side and left it lying there, but has been reconciled with it. What has just been said can also be expressed by saying that reason is purpose of activity. The exaltation of a supposed nature over a misconceived thinking, and especially the rejection of external teleology, has brought the form of purpose in general into discredit. Still, in the sense in which Aristotle too defines nature as purpose of activity, purpose is what is immediate and at rest, the unmoved which is also self-moving, and as such is subject. Its power to move, taken abstractly, is being for self, or pure negativity. The result is the same as the beginning, only because the beginning is the purpose. In other words, the actual is the same as the notion, only because the immediate as purpose contains the self or pure actuality within itself. The realized purpose, or the existent actuality, is movement and unfolded becoming, but is just this unrest that is the self, and the self is like that immediacy and simplicity of the beginning, because it is the result, that which has returned into itself, the latter being similarly just the self, and the self is the sameness and simplicity that relates itself to itself. The need to represent the absolute as subject has found expression in the propositions God is the eternal, the moral world order, love, and so on. In such proposition, the true is only posited immediately as subject, but is not presented as the movement of reflecting itself into itself. In a proposition of this kind, one begins with the word God. This by itself is a meaningless sound, a mere name. It is only the predicate that says what God is, gives him content and meaning. Only in the end of the proposition does the empty beginning become actual knowledge. This being so, it is not clear why one does not speak merely of the eternal, of the moral world order, and so on, or as the ancients did, of pure notions like being, the one, and so on, in short, of that which gives the meaning without adding the meaningless sound as well. But it is just this word that indicates that what is posited is not being, that is something that merely is, or essence, or a universal in general, but rather something that is reflected into itself, a subject. But at the same time, this is only anticipated, the subject is assumed as a fixed point to which, as their support, the predicates are affixed by a movement belonging to the knower as the subject of the subject, and which is not regarded as belonging to the fixed point itself. Yet it is only through the movement that the content could be represented as subject. The way in which this movement has been brought about is such that it cannot belong to the fixed point, yet after this point has been presupposed, the nature of the movement cannot really be other than what it is. It can only be external. Hence, the mere anticipation of the absolute is subject is not only not the actuality of the notion, but it even makes the actuality impossible. For the anticipation posits the subject as an inert point, whereas the actuality is self-movement. Among the various consequences that follow from what has just been said, this one in particular can be stressed, that knowledge is only actual and can only be bounded as science or as system. And furthermore, that a so-called basic proposition or principle of philosophy, if true, is also false, just because it is only a principle. It is therefore easy to refute it. The refutation consists in pointing out its defect, and it is defective because it is only the universal or principle, is only the beginning. If the refutation is thorough, it is derived and developed from the principle itself, not accomplished by counter-assertions and random thoughts from outside. The refutation would therefore properly consist in the further development of the principle, and in thus remedying the defectiveness, if it did not mistakenly pay attention solely to its negative action, without awareness of its progress on result on the positive side too. The generally positive exposition of this beginning is thus also conversely just as much a negative attitude towards it, namely towards its initially one-sided form of being immediate or purpose. It can therefore be taken equally well as a refutation of the principle that constitutes the basis of the system, but it is more correct to regard it as a demonstration that the basis or principle of the system is, in fact, only its beginning. That the true is actual only as system, or that substance is essentially subject, is expressed in the representation of the absolute as spirit, the most sublime notion and the one which belongs to the modern age and its religion. The spirit alone is the actual. It is essence of that which has being in itself. It is that which relates itself to itself and is determinate. It is other being and being for self, and this determinateness, or in itself externality, abides within itself. In other words, it is the in and for itself. But this being in and for itself is at first only for us, own or in itself. It is spiritual substance. It must also be this for itself. It must be the knowledge of the spiritual and the knowledge of itself as spirit. That is, it must be an object to itself, and just as immediately a sublated object reflected into itself, it is for itself only for us, insofar as its spiritual content is generated by itself. But insofar as it is also for itself, for its own self, this self-generation, the pure notion, is for it the objective element in which it has its existence, and it is in this way, in its existence, for itself, an object reflected into itself. The spirit that so developed knows itself as spirit is science. Science is its actuality, and the realm which it builds for itself in its own element. Pure self-recognition, in absolute otherness, this ether as such, is the ground and soil of science or knowledge in general. The beginning of philosophy presupposes or requires that consciousness should dwell in this element, but this element itself achieves its own perfection and transparency only through the movement of its becoming. It is pure spirituality as the universal that has the form of simple immediacy. The simple being in its existential form is the soil of science. It is thinking which has its being in spirit alone. Because this element, this immediacy of spirit, is the very substance of spirit, it is the transfigured essence, reflection which is itself simple, and which is for itself immediacy as such, being that is reflected into itself. Science, on its part, requires that self-consciousness should have raised itself into this ether in order to be able to live and actually to live with science and in science. Conversely, the individual has the right to demand that science should be at least provide him with the ladder to this standpoint, should show him that this standpoint within himself. His right is based on his absolute independence, which he is conscious of possessing in every phase of his knowledge. For in each one, whether recognized by science or not, and whatever the content may be, the individual is the absolute form, i.e., he is the immediate certainty of himself and If this expression be preferred, he is therefore unconditioned being. The standpoint of consciousness which knows objects in their antithesis to itself, and itself in antithesis to them, is for science the antithesis of its own standpoint. The situation in which consciousness knows itself to be at home is for science one marked by the absence of spirit. Conversely, the element of science is for consciousness a remote beyond in which it no longer possesses itself. Each of these two aspects of self-conscious spirit appears to the other as the inversion of truth. When natural consciousness entreats itself straight away to science, it makes an attempt, induced by it knows not what, to walk on its head too. Just this once. The compulsion to assume this unwanted posture and to go about it is a violence it is expected to do to itself, all unprepared and seemingly without necessity. Let science be in its own self what it may, relatively to immediate self-consciousness, it presents itself in an inverted posture, or becomes this self-consciousness. Or because this self-consciousness has the principle of its actual existence in the certainty of itself, science appears to it not to be actual, since self-consciousness exists on its own account outside of science. Science must therefore unite this element of self-certainty with itself, or rather show that and how this element belongs to it. So long as science lacks the actual dimension, it is only the content as the in itself, the purpose, that is as yet still something inward, and yet spirit, but only spiritual substance. This in itself has to express itself outwardly and become for itself, and this means simply that it has to posit self-consciousness as one with itself. It is this coming to be of science as such or of knowledge that is described in this phenomenology of spirit. Knowledge in its first phase, or immediate spirit, is the non-spiritual, i.e. sense consciousness. In order to become genuine knowledge, to beget the element of science, which is the pure notion of science itself, it must travel a long way and work its passage. The process of coming to be, considering the content and patterns it will display therein, will not be what is commonly understood by an initiation of the unscientific consciousness into science. It will also be quite different from the foundation of science. Least of all will it be like the rapturous enthusiasm, which, like a shot from a pistol, begins straight away with absolute knowledge and makes short work of other standpoints by declaring that it takes no notice of them. The task of leading the individual from his uneducated standpoint to knowledge had to be seen in his universal sense, just as it was the universal individual, self-conscious spirit whose formative education had to be studied. As regards the relation between them, every moment as it gains concrete form and a shape of its own, displays itself in the universal individual. The single individual is incomplete spirit, a concrete shape in whose whole existence one determinateness predominates, the others being present only in blurred outline. In a spirit that is more advanced than another, the lower concrete existence has been reduced to an inconspicuous moment. What used to be the important thing is now but a trace. Its pattern is shrouded to become a mere shadowy outline. The individual whose substance is the more advanced spirit runs through this past, just as one who takes up a higher science goes through the preparatory studies he has long since absorbed. In order to bring their content to mind, he recalls them to the inward eye, but has no lasting interest in them. The single individual must also pass through the formative stages of universal spirit so far as their content is concerned. But as shapes which spirit has already left behind, as stages on the way that has been made level with toil. Thus, as far as the factual information is concerned, we find that what in former ages engaged the attention of men of mature mind has been reduced to the level of facts, exercises, even games for children, and, in the child's progress through school, we shall recognise the history of the cultural development of the world traced, as it were, in a silhouette. This past existence is the already acquired property of universal spirit, which constitutes the substance of the individual, and hence it appears externally to him as his inorganic nature. In this respect, formative education, regarded as from the side of the individual, consists in his acquiring what thus lies at hand, devouring his inorganic nature, taking possession of it for himself. But, regarded from the side of universal spirit as substance, this is nothing but its own acquisition of self-consciousness, this bringing about of its own becoming and reflection into itself. Science sets forth this formative process in all its detail and necessity, exposing the mature configuration of everything which has already been reduced to a moment and property of spirit. The goal of spirit's insight into what knowing is, impatience, demands the impossible, to wit the attainment of the end without the means. But the length of this past has to be endured because, for one thing, each moment is necessary, and further, each moment has to be lingered over, because each is itself a complete individual shape, and one is only viewed in absolute perspective when its determinateness is regarded as a concrete whole, or the whole is regarded as uniquely qualified by that determination. Since the substance of the individual, the world spirit itself, has had the patience to pass through these shapes over the long passage of time, and to take upon itself the enormous labour of world history, in which it embodied in each shape as much of its entire content as that shape was capable of holding, and since it could not have attained consciousness of itself by any lesser effort, the individual certainly cannot be the nature of the case comprehended his own substance over more easily. Yet at the same time he does have less trouble, since all this has already been implicitly accomplished. The concept is already actually reduced to a possibility, its immediacy overcome, and the embodied shape reduced to abbreviated simple determinateness of thought. It is no longer existence in the form of being in itself, neither still in the original form or an abstract concept, nor submerged in existence, but is now the recollected in itself, ready for conversion into the form of being for self. How is this done must now be described more precisely. We take up the movement of the whole from the point where the sublation of existence as such is no longer necessary. What remains to be done, and what requires a high level of cultural reorientation, is to represent and to get acquainted with these forms. The existence that has been taken back into the substance has only been immediately transposed into the element of the self through that first negation. Hence this acquired property still has the same character of uncomprehended immediacy, of passive indifference, as existence itself. Existence has this merely passed over into figurative representation. At the same time, it is just something familiar, something which the existent spirit is finished and done with, so that it is no longer active or really interested in it, although the activity that has finished with existence is itself only the movement of the particular spirit. The spirit that does not comprehend itself in genuine knowing, on the other hand, is directed against the representation thus formed, against this mere familiarity. Knowing is the activity of the universal self, the concern of thinking. Quite generally, the familiar, just because it is familiar, is not cognitively understood. The commonest way in which we deceive either ourselves or others about understanding is by assuming something as familiar, and accepting it on that account, with all its pros and cons. Such knowing never gets anywhere, and it knows not why. subject and object, God, nature, understanding, sensibility, and so on, are uncritically taken for granted as familiar, established as valid, made into fixed points for starting and stopping, while these remain unmoved. The knowing activity goes back and forth between them, thus moving only on their surface. Apprehending and testing likewise consists in seeing whether everybody's impression of the matter coincides with what is asserted about these fixed points, whether it seems that way to him or not. The analysis of an idea, as it used to be carried out, was in fact nothing else than ridding it of the form in which it had become familiar. To break an idea up into its original elements is to return to its moments, which at least do not have the form of the given idea, but rather constitute the immediate property of the self. This analysis, to be sure, only arrives at thoughts, which are themselves familiar, fixed, and inert determinations. But what is thus separated and non-actual is an essential moment. For it is only because the concrete does divide itself and make itself into something non-actual that it is self-moving. The activity of dissolution is the power and work of the understanding, and most astonishing, the mightiest of powers, or rather the absolute power. The circle that remains self-enclosed and like substance holds its moments together, is an immediate relationship, and therefore which has nothing astonishing about it, but that an accident as such detached from what circumscribes it, what is bound and is actual only in its context with others, should attain an existence of its own and a separate freedom. This is the tremendous power of the negative. It is the energy of thought, of the pure I. Death, if that is what we want to call this non-actuality, is of all things the most dreadful, and to hold fast what is dead requires the greatest strength. Lacking strength, beauty hates the understanding, for asking of her what it cannot do. But the life of spirit is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather this life that endures it and maintains itself in it. It wins its truth only when, in utter dismemberment, it finds itself. It is this power, not as something positive, which closes its eyes to the negative, as when we say of something that it is nothing or is false, and then, having done with it, turn away and pass on to something else. On the contrary, spirit is this power only by looking the negative in the face and tarrying with it. This tarrying with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. This power is identical with what we earlier called the subject, which by giving determinateness and existence in its own element supersedes abstract immediacy, the immediacy which barely is, and thus is authentic substance, that being or immediacy whose mediation is not outside of it, but which is this mediation itself. The fact that the object represented becomes the property of pure self-consciousness, its elevation to universality in general, is only one aspect of formative education, not its fulfillment. The manner of study is, in ancient times, differed from that of the modern age in that the former was the proper and complete formation of the natural consciousness. Putting itself to the test at every point of its existence, and philosophizing about everything it came across, it made itself into a universality that was active through and through. In modern times, however, the individual finds the abstract form ready-made. The effort to grasp and appropriate it is more the direct driving force of what is within it, and the truncated generation of the universal, than it is the emergence of the latter from the concrete variety of existence. Hence, the task nowadays consists not so much in purging the individual of an immediate sensuous mode of apprehension and making him into a substance, that is an object of thought and that thinks, but rather is just the opposite, in freeing determinate thoughts from their fixity so as to give actuality to the universal and impart to it spiritual life. But it is far harder to bring fixed thoughts into a fluid state than to do so with sensuous existence. The reason for this was given above. Fixed thoughts have the I, the power of the negative, or pure actuality for the substance and element of their existence, whereas sensuous determinations have only powerless abstract immediacy, or appearing as such. Thoughts become fluid when pure thinking, this inner immediacy, recognizes itself as a moment, or when the pure certainty of self abstracts from itself, not by leaving itself out or setting aside itself, but by giving up the fixity of its self-positing, by giving up not only the fixity of the pure concrete, which the I itself is, in contrast with its differentiated content, but also the fixity of the differentiated moments, which, posited in the element of pure thinking, share the unconditioned nature of the I. The I, I should say. Through this movement, the pure thoughts of become notions, and are only now what they are in truth. Self-movement, circles, spiritual essences, which is what their substance is. This movement of pure essences constitutes the nature of scientific method in general, regarded as the connectedness of their content. It is a necessary expansion of that content into an organic whole. Through the movement, the path by which the notion of knowledge is reached becomes likewise a necessary and complete process of becoming, so that this preparatory path ceases to be a causal philosophizing that fastens onto this or that object, relationship or thought that happens to pop up in the imperfect consciousness, or tries to base the truth on the pros and cons, the inferences and consequences of rigidly defined thoughts. Instead, the pathway through the movement of the notion will encompass the entire sphere of secular consciousness in its necessary development. Further, an exposition of this kind constitutes the first part of science, because the existence of spirit, qua primary, is nothing but the immediate of the beginning, but not yet its return into itself. The element of immediate existence is therefore what distinguishes this part of science from the others. The statement of this distinction leads us to a discussion of some fixed ideas which usually crop up in this connection. The immediate existence of spirit, consciousness, contains the two moments of knowing and the objectivity negative to knowing. Since it is in this element of consciousness that spirit develops itself and explicates its moments, these moments contain that antithesis, and they all appear as shapes of consciousness. The science of this pathway is the science of the experience which consciousness goes through. The substance and its movement are viewed as the object of consciousness. Consciousness knows and comprehends only what it falls, only what fails. Consciousness knows and comprehends only what falls within its experience. For what is contained in this is nothing but spiritual substance, and this too as object of the self. But spirit becomes object because it is just this movement of becoming another to itself, i.e. becoming an object to itself, and of suspending this otherness. And experience is the name we give to just the movement in which the immediate, the unexperienced, the abstract, whether it be of sensuous but still unsensed being, or only thought of as simple, becomes alienated from itself, and then returns to itself from this alienation, and is only then revealed to be for the first time in its actuality and truth, just as it then has become a property of consciousness also. Sensuous existence. Don't you just love it? Moving on. The disparity which exists in consciousness between the I and the substance which is its object is the distinction between them, the negative in general. This can be regarded as the defect of both, though it is their soul or that which moves them. That is why some of the ancients conceived the world conceived the void, rather, as the principle of motion, for they rightly saw the moving principle as the negative, though they did not as yet grasp that the negative is the self. Now, although this negative appears at first as a disparity between the I and its object, it is just as much the disparity of the substance with itself. Thus, what seems to happen outside of it, to be an activity directed against it, is really its own doing, and substance shows itself to be essentially subject. When it has shown this completely, spirit has made its existence identical with its essence. It has itself for its object, just as it is, and the abstract element of immediacy and of the separation of knowing and truth is overcome. Being is then absolutely mediated. It is a substantial content which is just as immediately the property of the I. It is self-like, or the notion. With this, the phenomenology is concluded, although it's still a long way to go with the preface just yet. What spirit prepares for itself in it is the element of true knowing. In this element, the moment of spirit now spread themselves out in that form of simplicity which knows its object as its own self. They no longer fall apart into the antithesis of being and knowing, but remain in the simple oneness of knowing. They are the true in the form of the true, and their difference is only the difference of content. Their movement, which organizes itself in this element into a whole, is logic or speculative philosophy. Now, because the system of the experience of spirit embraces only the appearance of spirit, the advance from this system to the science of the true is its true shape, seems to be merely negative, and one might wish to be spared the negative as something false, and demand to be led to the truth. Without more ado, why bother with the false? The view already discussed, namely that we should begin with science straight away, is to be answered at this point by examining the nature of the negative in general, regarded as what is false. This is the topic regarding which established ideas notably obstruct the approach to truth. It will give us occasion to speak of mathematical cognition, which unphilosophical knowledge regards as the ideal that philosophy must strive to attain, though it has so far striven in vain. True and false belong among those determinate notions which are held to be inert and wholly separate essences, one here and one there, each standing fixed and isolated from the other, with which it has nothing in common. Against this view, it must be maintained that truth is not a minted coin that can be given and pocketed ready-made, nor is there such a thing as the false, any more than there is something evil. The evil and the false, to be sure, are not as bad as the devil, for in the devil they are even made into a particular subjective agent. As the false and the evil, they are mere universals, though each has its own essence as against the other. The false, for here it is only of this that we speak, would be the other, the negative of the substance, which is the content of knowledge, is the true, which as the content of knowledge is the true. But the substance is itself essentially the negative, partly as a distinction of determination of the content, and partly as a simple distinguishing, that is, as self and knowledge in general. One can, of course, know something falsely. To know something falsely means that there is a disparity between knowledge and its substance. But this very disparity is the process of distinguishing in general, which is the essential moment in knowing. Out of this distinguishing, of course, comes their identity, and this resultant identity is the truth, but it is not the truth as if the disparity had been thrown away, like dross from pure metal, not even like the tool which remains separate from the finished vessel. Disparity rather as the negative, the self, is itself, still directly present in the true as such. Yet we cannot therefore say that the false is a moment of the true, let alone a component part of it. To say that in every falsehood there is a grain of truth is to treat the two like oil and water, which cannot be mixed and are only externally combined. It is precisely on account of the importance of designating the moment of complete otherness that the terms true and false must no longer be used, where such otherness has been annulled, just as to talk of the unity of subject and object, of finite and infinite, of being and thought, etc., is inept. Since object and subject, etc., signify what they are outside of their unity, and since in their unity they are not meant to be what their expression says they are, just so the false is no longer qua false a moment of truth. Dogmatism is a way of thinking, whether in ordinary knowing or in the study of philosophy. It is nothing else but the opinion that the true consists in a proposition which is a fixed result or which is immediately known. To such questions as when was Caesar born, or how many feet were there in a stadium, etc., a clear-cut answer ought to be given, just as it is definitely true that the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides of a right-angled triangle. But the nature of a so-called truth of that kind is different from the nature of philosophical truths. Dogmatism as a way of thinking, whether in ordinary knowing or in the study of philosophy, is nothing else but the opinion that the true consists in a proposition which is a fixed result or which is immediately known. To such questions as when was Caesar born, or how many feet were there in a stadium, etc., a clear-cut answer ought to be given, just as it is definitely true that the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides of the right-angled triangle. But the nature of a so-called truth of that kind is different from the nature of philosophical truths. Let us speculate.